I'm going to take us back to the Old Testament again as we kind of work our way through Isaiah. I don't want to rush through this. There's so much good there that often overlooked in preaching. Sometimes it gets covered in classes, but these old prophets can be confusing. And it is, they prophesied in a time of darkness. And yet they weren't totally without light. God held these nations and these peoples of the old world to some accountability. And they were accountable for what they did know, or at least what they could have known. And so also He held these ancient peoples of the city of Tyre. And in this darkness, we have lights, points of light. And that's what Isaiah is, who shines a light into this darkness and helps us to see in the midst of all the gloom something that is hopeful. And even here in this burden of Tyre, the last verse of this chapter, there's something hopeful there. And so it's a blessing. I call it the burden and blessing of Tyre. Now, let's talk about Tyre just a little bit. What are we talking about? If you have a map in the back of your Bible, for those of you in the parking lot, turn to a map of Israel in the back of your Bible, and you go up north along that coast. And north of Israel, about halfway up that coast from Tarsus to Egypt, you'll find the city of Tyre. Close to it, the city of, it's either spelled with an S or a Z, Zidon or Sidon, depending on how the spelling comes out there. And the region around Tyre and Zidon is the land of Phoenicia. And these Phoenicians, they were different peoples from the other peoples round about them. We read about them in the Bible. There was the king of Tyre, who was in league with David. And so as David conquered all of the lands round about Israel, this king of Tyre, he had enough sense to say, I'm going to make friends with this conquering king. And when David wanted to gather materials for the building of the temple, he asked that king, and that king gladly gave him cedars out of Lebanon for his son Solomon to build that temple in Jerusalem. But all is not good that we read about Tyre. You see, one of the daughters of one of the kings of Tyre was Jezebel. Now, that very name just sounds like an evil character, doesn't it? I've never known any little girls that their mothers named them Jezebel. I hope they don't. And Jezebel married Ahab and brought the false worship of Baal of Tyre into Israel, so that those in northern Israel forsook God and went to there. Are we getting some interference here? Okay, thank you, Thomas, for coming up to that. Now, Tyre is also very interesting, though, in ancient history and classical history. Those Phoenicians were the ancient mariners of the Mediterranean Sea. They were able to construct boats and get out into that sea, and they established the trade routes that had been used, and probably many of those same trade routes still used to this day as the trade around the Mediterranean. And they sailed far and wide. There's an old record of the Phoenicians sailing around the Horn of Africa and coming up into the Indian Ocean. And this was 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama did, of the Portuguese. That's the one I learned about doing that in my little history class going through school, of those explorers. But long before Vasco da Gama, there was these Phoenicians making that journey. And they sailed into Britain. And some have speculated, though the evidence is slight if existing, but some have speculated that some of those Phoenicians may have been the first to have crossed the Atlantic in their vessels. They established the city of Carthage in North Africa. It was a colony. that grew to a powerful city, and due to their dominance of the Mediterranean, they threatened Rome. In fact, Hannibal, you've heard of Hannibal, the man that took the elephants across the Alps in an attempt to go down through Italy and capture Rome. Hannibal was a Carthaginian, I guess you'd say it. And then you may have heard of Cicero, great orator of the Roman Senate, who would plead his cause. But Cicero, he recognized the threat from Carthage. And it is said that Cicero would end every speech he made before that Roman Senate. When he would get through with the speech, he would say, "And Carthage must be destroyed." Well, that city of Tyre, it had gotten rich off that trade. And one reason Tyre prospered is because it was on an island. That's just out from the main coast. And in fact, there were two cities of Tyre. There was a city of Tyre on the island, the fortress city, and then there was the commerce city that was there on inland where many people lived. But it's because they had that island and were set off, they were not subject to attack from outside forces like other cities, and they could retreat to that fortress until those cities would move on and those enemies would move on, till Alexander the Great came. Alexander the Great said, "I'm going to conquer that island fortress." And so he destroyed the old city on the shore, and he took all the rubble of that city and had his soldiers throw it in the ocean. And as you see on the screen here, they actually built a dam or aqueduct, or wouldn't be an aqueduct, but a peninsula all the way from the shore, all the way out to the city. And he marched those soldiers across, and he wiped out Tyre, and sold many of those that survived, he sold them into slavery. Well, that's Tyre from some biblical history, and Tyre from some classical history. Let's see what Isaiah has to say about the burden of Tyre. Now, I want you to remember, this is many years before Alexander the Great. This is during the time of the Assyrians. And the Assyrians was like a scourge over all the lands and nations round about Israel. And Tyre would suffer in that scourge as well. And so Isaiah, in his prophecies, and in those burdens, has the burden of Tyre. Now, it's hard for us to look all the way into what is all the prophet talking about when he says these things. And I know you read this and it can get confusing, and it's good we don't have to sort it all out. And let me give you some guidance here that we can probably drive, and I'm not going to be dogmatic about these things, but let's see if we can get some guidance as we read through this, what Isaiah is saying. He says, "Howl, ye ships of Tarshish." Well, now you're going to read several places here. Tarshish, Chittim, Zidon, Sihor. These are the places that had received benefit and profit from the existence of Tyre. The ships coming to and fro, and they'd prospered off of that. And now they see Tyre suffering under these Assyrians. They say, "Howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste. There's no house, no entering in. From the land of Chittim it is revealed to them. Be still, ye inhabitants of the Tyre, thou whom the merchants of Zidon that passed over the sea have replenished." Tyre and Zidon, and those merchants in Zidon, they'd get the sailors from Tyre to go out and make their trades, and it prospered Tyre, and it prospered those merchants. He says, "By the great waters, the seed of Sihor, the harvest of the river is her revenue, and she is a mart of nations." Well, that'd be Tyre, the mart of nations. I didn't look up where Sihor was, but the harvest of the river. It sounds like Sihor may have been up a river, and these ships would sail up those rivers and come back, their harvest being the merchandise and the goods that they would trade from place to place. "Be thou ashamed, O Zidon, for the sea hath spoken, even the strength of the sea, saying, I travail not, nor bring forth children, neither do I nourish up young men, nor bring up virgins. Well, what are we talking about here? Well, I wish I could tell you for sure. I would suggest that it's talking about the benefits they had received from the sea, here described as the young men and women that would be given birth to and all, that's cut off now because of this Assyrian scourge. As the report concerning Egypt, so shall they be sorely pained at the report of Tyre. You're going to hear what happened in Egypt and weep, and they'll hear what happened in Tyre and weep. Pass ye over to Tarshish, howl ye inhabitants of the isle. And then this, is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is of ancient days? Her own fleet shall carry her afar off to sojourn. This, Tyre, is this that joyous city that once existed, now in this misery? Oh, they'll sail away. They're going to have to leave Tyre, and they'll settle in other places. Why did this happen? Who's got a problem with Tyre? Who hath taken this counsel against Tyre? Well, look down, you see the answer. The Lord of hosts hath purposed it. And then further down, the Lord hath given a commandment against the merchant city. God's doing this to Tyre. Now, why would God do this? You read the book of Proverbs, you go read 7 things God hates, and one of the first things he lists, it's a proud look. Tyre was proud of themselves. It says that the crowning city, whose merchants are princes, whose traffickers are the honorable of the earth. That's what others thought of them and what they thought of themselves. It's like Tyre had prospered here, but it's sort of like the building of a Tower of Babel. They'd accomplished what they'd accomplished, saying, look what we have done. They didn't have God involved in their plans. And then so to stain the proud of all glory, and to bring in contempt all the honorable of the earth, pass through a land as a river, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no strength. He stretches out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms, and he's destroyed the strongholds thereof. And Tyre is called up in this destruction. And he said, thou shalt no more rejoice. O thou oppressed virgin, daughter of Zion, arise, pass over to Chittim. There also thou shalt have no rest. Chittim, well, they think that might be the Isle of Cyprus. It's somewhere else. You'll go somewhere else. You won't have rest there either. Behold, look what he did on the opposite end of things. Tyre's waved over here on the west. Go far to the east. Look what happened to Babylon. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans. This people was not, till Assyria founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness. They set up the towers thereof, and raised up the places thereof, and he brought it to ruin. Howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. And then Tyre will be forgotten 70 years. Well, this wasn't a permanent destruction, and the 70 years doesn't have to necessarily be a literal 70 years time. It's maybe describing like through the reign of a king, or a generation would pass before Tyre would return to some of the glory that it lost in this. According to the days of one king, at the end of 70 years, Tyre shall sing as a harlot. Now here's a somewhat disturbing way to describe what Tyre would become. You know what a harlot is, and how she allows herself to be exploited for her own benefit. Well, Tyre, you're going to sing like a harlot. He describes the way that Tyre had dwelt with the nations as fornication with those nations, and yet had prospered in that. And she that had been the harlot to the nations, she'd get out her harp, she'd play again, as they might remember and return to her as they had in the past. And so we see, take an harp, go about the city, thou harlot that hast been forgotten. Make sweet melody. Sing many songs that thou mayest be remembered. And it shall come to pass after the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre, and she shall turn to her hire, and shall commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world upon the face of the earth. What does it mean? It means the way Tyre had prospered in the past is the way she'd prosper in the future. But this is all the material, earthly, worldly prosperity. He's not talking here about her spiritual condition. But then the last verse. This last verse. What do we make of this last verse? And her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. It shall not be treasured up nor laid up, for her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord, to eat sufficiently, and for durable clothing. Her merchandise, holiness to the Lord. She's not going to keep it for herself. It's not for her benefit. But she's going to have some merchandise that is a benefit to God's people. They were the ones that will be clothed and fed by her. What's Isaiah see here? If we study this chapter in isolation, we would just have to say, well, maybe we'll never know. But put it in the context of what Isaiah has been prophesying. And all through Isaiah's prophesying, he's talking about a day to come, the last days, when the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and all nations flow into it. And one by one, as he touches on the doom and destruction of the present nations that are around, he ends with some words of hope. But there'll be a day when, and then there's something better out there. And so with that idea, we look to the New Testament. Did you know Christ himself went to the coast of Tyre and Sidon? Let me read that story. Matthew 15 and verse 21. Then Jesus went hence and departed into the coast of Tyre and Sidon. By the coast now, that word in the King James Version, that means the borderland. It doesn't necessarily mean out by the sea, but along the borders between Israel and the Phoenicians. Jesus went there. And behold, a woman of Canaan came out of the same coast and cried unto him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with the devil. This is other places called the Syrophoenician woman. This is not a woman of Israel, but a woman of Tyre that had heard a Messiah will come, a son of David. And what she had heard about Jesus gave her hope. So he answered and said, he answered not a word. And his disciples came and besought him, saying, Send her away, for she crieth after us. He answered and said, I'm not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus did not come here to go throughout all the Gentile nations, taking care of them. He was here for Israel, and he would later commission his apostles to carry the gospel into all the world. The problem this woman had, she showed up too soon. They weren't open for business yet for her, not in God's plans. Let me show you something about the tender heart of God. Then she came and worshiped him, saying, Lord, help me. She wasn't interested in the theology and the plans and the schemes and the great things. Her daughter's vexed with the devil. Help me. Just help me. And look what Jesus did. He answered and said, you put her off her. It's not meet to give the children's bread and cast it to dogs. Now don't take that as an insult. He's comparing the children of Israel, and it's not for all the Gentiles. It's not meet. No, that's not what my miracles are about. That's not what I'm for. She said in great humility, look at this. True, Lord, if the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from the master's table. Now, that's how you get to the heart of God. You humble yourselves to God. You say, help me. I'll take any kind of help. God is a God of compassion and goodness and love, and He doesn't turn from that. Jesus answered and said unto her, O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt. And her daughter was made whole that same hour. People of Tyre came to Jesus. It says in Luke 16, 17, and 18, He came down with them and stood in the plain and accompanied the disciples and a great multitude of peoples out of all Judea and Jerusalem and from the sea coast of Tyre and Sidon, which came to hear Him and to be healed of their diseases. And they that were vexed with unclean spirits, and they were healed. Matthew 11, 20 through 22. He'd done all these miracles, and he looked at places like Capernaum and Chorazin where he'd done his miracles, and he began to upbraid the cities wherein most of his mighty works were done, because they repented not. Woe unto thee, Chorazin! Woe unto thee, Bethsaida! But the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I say unto you, it'll be more tolerable than Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. That Canaanite woman that came to Jesus had heard. She hadn't seen all those mighty works. She'd heard, and she came. And those of Chorazin that had seen and were turning from Him, woe unto you. And then we read that the gospel went there. Paul is coming to Jerusalem with the aid that he has for the poor in Jerusalem. As he makes his way in Acts chapter 21, verses 2 through 6, we read, in finding a ship sailing over to Phoenicia, we went abroad and set forth. Now when we had discovered Cyprus, we left it on the left hand and sailed into Syria and landed at Tyre. Now here's what happened. There the ship was to unlade her burden, and finding disciples, we tarried there 7 days, who said to Paul through the Spirit he should not go up to Jerusalem. And when it accomplished those days, we departed and went our way, and they all brought us on our way with wives and children until we were out of the city and knelt down on the shore and prayed. And when we'd taken our leave of one another, we took ship and they returned home again. Paul sat down and prayed with the church at Tyre on the shores before he departed. And then we read about Paul being carried as a prisoner to Rome. And he comes by again. And look what happens. Acts 27, 2 through 4. And entering a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And the next day we touched at Sidon, that neighboring city of Tyre. And Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go to his friends and refresh himself. And when we launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Those those people of Tyre and Sidon, comforted Paul, refreshed Paul, helped Paul. As Paul goes through the world preaching the gospel. Look at the blessing now. Isaiah 23:18. And her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. It shall not be treasured or laid up, for her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord to eat deficiency and for durable clothing. I know this. The greatest blessing that Tyre ever received was the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the greatest benefit that they have been to the world has not been material things. It's in helping that gospel spread throughout the world. Paul would often travel on that Mediterranean Sea, and it was the heritage of those Phoenicians that established those old trade routes and manned those old ships. And it may have been some of the heirs of that who were manning those ships that carried Paul from place to place as he preached the gospel. Now, I know this. The greatest blessing that we can receive is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the greatest benefit that we can be to this world to help spread that gospel to its four corners. Those dark ages are past. We now live in the time of the light, and we have the light if we'll turn to it. Let's hold it forth as a shining light, that all the world may see, and live our life with that meaning and purpose that has not just temporary material benefit, but that eternal spiritual benefit. And so with that, I extend an invitation. You do like Darrell did. Humble yourself and be baptized into Jesus Christ. So we'll sing this invitation song.